Greetings, Uncle Travelling Matt here, and I'm sitting on one of the ghats in Varanasi, and I thought I'd make a kind of bit of an interlude video, a kind of context video, and this is something that's been on my mind for a few days now. I guess it's been bubbling away ever since I arrived in India, and particularly since I've arrived in Varanasi, and it's my thoughts on religion and I guess Hinduism, or the Hinduisms in particular. So people who know me for a long time know that I'm a bit of an interfaith explorer, and I like to explore different faiths and what they mean to me personally. And the one that I've always struggled with the most is Hinduism, and part of that is because, as I said in earlier videos, it's almost not like a religion, it's like a collection of religions that the British bungled together under one name. And so if you separate the traditions out a bit, it makes a bit more sense. So you can explore Krishna, you can explore Shiva and all that kind of stuff. And that's helped me no end, but it's not capturing what I think Hinduism is, and in a way, in a greater way, what is religion. And there is something, like, although it's mysterious, although it's very incomprehensible, there is something very appealing about Hinduism. That said, there's also a lot of things that aren't, like the caste system and stuff like that. And what I think it is that Hinduism is unique in that it is a survival of ancient religion. And so what you get when you witness Hindu practices is you get a glimpse of when man began, or at least when the civilized world began, right? So when you look at it, it's all very primeval, and primeval is the word that just keeps coming back to me time and time again, as we're going back to the beginning of time. And it's this, what are these primeval aspects? It's smoke drifting upwards, it's fire, it's the smell of incense, it's water, particularly fresh water, it's the sun, it's the moon, it's the relationship with animals. And all of these things go back to the very dawn of time, or at least the very dawn of agricultural history. And of course, when humans became agricultural, they changed significantly from hunter-gatherers. And so, yeah, this is maybe not a hunter-gatherer religion, but it is from the dawn of agrarian times. And when I witness certain Hindu rituals, there's this earthiness, and there's this feeling that I'm witnessing almost like ancient British paganism, or I'm witnessing ancient Middle Eastern religion, like Phoenician religion, like Baal worship and that kind of stuff. And people who've watched a lot of my videos will know that, like, I find it very powerful, those connections with the pre-Abrahamic stuff. Like when I went to Lebanon, I went to Byblos and stuff like that. You're connecting with the dawn of man, and that is what is powerful about Hinduism. Now, that's to say that Hinduism is not a pure survivor from that. And I think if it were pure, it would not have survived, because those religions have died out everywhere else. And I think if you look at Hinduism, what it is it is that very earthy paganism. But because they came along and wrote the Vedas, which nobody's read because they're massive, and it gave it a kind of intellectual veneer, which meant that it could then survive into the book learning era. And it's a religion that's morphed at times when it needed to. So, you know, when the threat of Islam and particularly Sufism came along, you know, then you got the Bhakti tradition, which is very much like Sufi thinking but within a Hindu context. And so it was able to survive that threat, whereas, for example, Zoroastrianism in Iran largely didn't. And, you know, the caste system, of course, does go back to the earliest times. So, you know, all these religions had a priestly caste. The Druids in Britain, they were a priestly caste. You look at all the ancient Near Eastern religions, there were these priestly castes. So the fact that you've got one here, it's just, for us, it's so weird because it's so alien, where we've gone so very egalitarian in our thinking. But of course, it managed to survive because there were ways to get around it, like the Bhakti traditions and that kind of stuff. But if you want the original, it's still there. I mean, interestingly, I find the linga, the symbol of Shiva, to be a very, you know, again, primeval and powerful symbol, because it's simple and yet it hits the real, you know, root of what people are worshipping. And yet apparently there is a school of thought that says that came about only when Islam came along with the, you know, the iconoclasm, and so it was a way of representing Shiva that was not pictures. I don't know how true that is, but I think that's interesting. So yes, it's not a pure survivor, but it's the closest thing we have, and of course it is the oldest religion. Now some people say, oh wait a minute, what about Judaism? But Judaism is very different, and you know, I've done a lot of study on Judaism as well as I explored a lot of Jewish sites, and Judaism probably was quite similar to Hinduism, but the thing that changed Judaism was the you know, the great exile to Babylon twice. And what that meant is that it had to completely reinvent itself as a religion, and it reinvented itself as a book-based religion. I believe that before then it wasn't, and I also believe it wasn't a monotheistic religion either, and there's plenty of evidence to back that up. I mean, you know, Yahweh had a wife called Asherah, and there, you know, and she had a statue in the temple. So, you know, all this about you can't represent the form of God, and, you know, God is only one and all that came much later, perhaps 500, 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. So traditional Judaism may have been a lot more like Hinduism. It's certainly pretty similar, I would imagine, to Baal worship and whatever the Phoenicians were doing. But Judaism today is so based on the exile, and then of course the effect of Christianity. And if you look at a lot of synagogues today and the style of synagogue worship, it is very churchy, and you know, the two religions have impacted each other in a huge way. And indeed I've talked to rabbis about that, and you know, it's them that told me this. It's, you know, it's not some attack on Judaism by any stretch of the imagination. So the way I look at religions is you've got this spectrum, right? And at one end you've got perhaps like Hinduism, which is very ancient, it's very earthy, it's very primeval. Yes, there's lots of superstition, there's not a lot of book stuff in there, but there's a lot of legends floating around, it's very localized. And then at the other you've got probably something like Salafist Islam or evangelical Christianity, where it's 100% book based. So whatever the book says does, and you worship in empty rooms, you know, kind of shut off from nature almost. And if you're going to represent nature, it's in a very stylized form. In other words, you've twisted that nature into the form of man, and you can't deviate from your scriptures. You know, they tell you every last detail, such as how many steps to go to the toilet and how you should pray exactly. So, you know, and you can see, like Hinduism, it's wild, it's untamed. So you can dance, you can sing, you can, you know, walk around naked, you dive in the river. Whereas you look at like Salafist Islam, well, music's haram, dance is haram, you know, even looking at women is haram. And they are the two ends of the spectrum, and of course it's interesting that they should both survive in this city, you know, and how one looks at the other is, you know, I really, it must be an oil and water thing. I mean, it must be, because the two are so opposite. And then in the middle you've got the others. So, you know, Sikhism's quite book-based. It's quite, although there's a lot of Hindu stuff in there, it's probably more towards the book-based end. But then you've got the musical element and all that, and the cultural elements, and you've got Christianity as well. You know, yeah, I've talked about the evangelicals, but then you do the Orthodox are far closer to the Hindu end of stuff, where very based on localized saint cults, and they embrace the mystery. And of course, you know, within Islam itself, you've got the Sufis who are far more mystical. And as I said earlier, I see so much commonality between the worship in this region at a Sufi shrine and the worship in a Hindu temple. I think they're almost identical, and they're a world away from the worship, you know, the set prayers in a mosque or a church. And I just think it's really interesting. And I guess, what does that mean for us as human beings? Well, the problem is we're brought up in our own traditions, and all of our traditions have strengths and weaknesses. And so if you're brought up in an evangelical tradition or an Islamic tradition, it must be very hard to look at Hinduism and accept some of what goes on there. You know, it must seem evil. And I know that from my own, like, I'm an Anglican, right? So we're not exactly the Christian hardcore. But even accepting, like, goddess worship was very hard for me to do, and it only came about through Mary. And there are still some practices I balk at a little bit. But, you know, but then conversely to the Hindu, it is absolutely beyond comprehension how, you know, because they're very easygoing. They're like, yeah, we'll go and pray at the Buddha shrine, we'll go and pray in a church. But then it just seems utterly rude and a bit dumb that, you know, like Muslims won't pray in their temples, or certain types of Christians won't pray in their temples, and won't, because it just seems disrespectful. Like, you know, well, I'll respect your gods, but can you respect mine? And then they go, no, you're wrong. And that's always going to be a barrier, I think. I mean, these thoughts are a bit scattered, and I don't know where they'll lead. I'll probably end up writing an essay about them, I normally do. But for me, that word that just returns again is primeval. Hinduism takes you back to the dawn of man, and if you go there, yes, a lot of the Indian clothing is weird and wonderful and alien, but if you strip it back, it's worship of water. We need water to live. Fire. You know, there's death, life. You know, look at their trinity. It's the creator, the sustainer, and the destroyer. You know, that's the dawn of man. And indeed, last year I went to the Indus Valley civilization, all the ruins of it, Mohenjo-Daro, and in one of the oldest cities in the world, and the only sign of religious life is a bath, a sacred bath in the center, and then there's the symbol of the bull. And of course the bull, well, the holy cow, is still very sacred. They sit around all the streets here, and everywhere you go there are statues of bulls. And interestingly, of course, the bull's horns make a crescent moon, which, well, you know, even right at the other end of the spectrum, there's still little bits that sneak through, and they always will. Thank you for travelling, Matt. Keep travelling.